Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, David. There's really exciting news out of Washington, and you may not have heard this, but coming up on July 4th, 3 people can get together inside without a mask if they've been vaccinated. Do you think we should send President Biden a picture of our lunch today? But I guess I'm not really thinking that I would have expected anything less from the president. You see, the president has sort of a different understanding of the contagion. Apparently, Dr. Fauci has told him, you can catch this thing through the webcam. So you've seen when President Biden does a web interview, a Zoom call, he carefully puts his mask on. So I'm just saying, I mean, you could catch it anywhere, maybe even on your webcam. I don't know. But I don't mean to make light of this completely. I've had 2 friends who have died. I had a staff member who almost died. But the thing is we ought to tell people the honest to God's truth, shouldn't we? Shouldn't we just be honest with people? This is a very deadly disease for older folks and not so much for younger folks. It's also a pretty deadly, significant disease for those who are overweight. So instead of them telling us all this stuff and saying everybody's the same, be honest with us. I think people get it. I think the people are way smarter than their government. Have you noticed the statistics? 85% of those over 65 have gotten the vaccine. I think they get it. But when you try to tell a 19-year-old they need it as much as an 85-year-old, the 19-year-old goes, well, the death rate's about 1 in a million for me. It's less deadly than the seasonal flu. Why don't you be honest with me? Tell me what the risks are of the vaccine versus the disease for me, and let's be honest. They're very tiny for both, for young people. So the thing is if we're honest with people, we might have a better chance. The governor's come out with another edict. He says he's going to give you permission to do something, to have some of your freedom back when 2.5 million people are vaccinated. There's no science behind this. In fact, it's illegal and unconstitutional for him to say this. The legislature already told him he no longer has the power. The legislature came back in January and in a unified, overwhelming fashion said to the governor, guess what? Emergencies have a time limit to them. And when the time expires, the legislature has to have some input. This is the most common sense thing I can imagine. It's one of the most necessary things. It is what keeps the governor from being an autocrat. And I don't say that and use that term loosely. Without checks and balances, if people in government think they can do whatever they want without consulting the legislative branch, we would have tyranny. This is just amazing that he could think this. So what did the governor do? They came back in session, limited his emergency powers, the powers they had granted to him in the 1990s. They amended their own legislation. And so what did the governor do? He sued them. The governor's suing the state legislature, and here's his argument. He found a liberal judge in Frankfurt to uphold him initially. It's going to go before the Supreme Court. But his argument is this. I am the governor of Kentucky, and I have inherent powers. These are granted to me by, I guess, the Almighty, and I can do whatever I want, no matter what the legislature says. I have inherent powers during the time of a public health crisis. Can you imagine? Who would have ever guessed that someone could tell you how many people would be in your restaurant, in your hotel, whether you could open your hair salon, whether you could open a bowling alley, whether you could open a doctor's office, whether you could travel, whether you could go to church, whether you could go to a church school. And the thing is, some advice is good. Some of the advice I even agree with. If you were asking me in March of last year, should you go to church if you're 85 years old and sit in an enclosed area for 2 hours? My personal advice would have been no. But I would have never mandated that you couldn't go to church. See, in a free society, each individual assesses their risk and makes their decisions. You take a risk every day. You're going to take a risk getting in your car. Should we have a governor on your car that says your car can't go more than 25 miles an hour? Cars kill way more people than this. The influenza every year kills more people among those under 25 than this disease does. Should we have mandates on people every year for the influenza? The question is, are we going to be a free society or not? This question is going before the court. This will be the most important case before the Kentucky Supreme Court in my lifetime. It's going to happen in June. I'm worried, frankly, and I'd be interested to see what the legislators say about this. I'm very worried. The court has shown a propensity to give the governor carte blanche power during this. But the thing is they've amended their own statute. Are we going to say that the state legislature cannot amend one of their statutes to limit the governor's powers? Imagine how this could even get worse over time. The federal courts have rebuked him. They rebuked him on schools, they rebuked him on travel, they rebuked him on church attendance. They were sending the police to church. What world do we live in where the police are recording your license plates at church? What kind of world is that? Now, there's one other thing, and I don't think they addressed it this time, but I hope they will. I think we're at a big disadvantage on the checks and balances in our state in that they cannot call themselves back into session. The problem is, from March until January, he basically was king. Even if the legislature wanted to stop him, and they did, wanted to regulate his power, wanted to limit his power, they couldn't call themselves back in session. So I, for one, think we ought to change our Constitution, let the legislature have the power. I don't want them all the time in session, frankly, but I think they have to have that power. Otherwise, we'll have long periods of time where the governor just does what he wants. And look, I'm a Republican, but if this were a Republican governor, I'd be saying the same thing. We've had Republican governors that have acted this way as well. There needs to be a division of power. Power is a corrupting influence. I think it was Lincoln who said, any man can stand adversity, but if you want to truly challenge the character of a man, give him power. How many people will not use power? How many people will relinquish that power and not abuse that power? I have good news and bad news from Washington. The good news is we are no longer going to be sending stimulus checks to dead people. You may recall we sent 1.1 million checks to dead people last year, over $1 billion. It wasn't a small error, 1 million checks. You say, how can this happen? Well, one way it happens is there's something called the master death file. And there's also the Social Security database. In the Social Security database, do you know how many people are listed as being over 112? 6.6 million. How many people do you really think are over 112? About 5, maybe 10 in the world. So we have 6 million people still listed. In fact, there are 2 Social Security numbers still being used. One fellow was born in 1869 and the other one 1874, and they're still being used. We still don't have the wherewithal to figure this out. So the good news is we're no longer going to send dead people checks. The bad news is it's going to take them 3 years to figure out how to do it. This is the insanity of your government. So when people say there's no place we could cut, we've cut government to the bone and there's nothing left, don't believe them. I'll give you an example. In the recent infrastructure package, they're calling reparations infrastructure. They're calling free college, free child care infrastructure. They're calling free health care. They're talking socialized medicine is infrastructure. I thought roads and bridges and locks and dams were things that Republicans and Democrats could come together to support. I'm part of a bipartisan coalition to talk about real infrastructure. But reparations isn't infrastructure. Defunding the police is not infrastructure. Free this, free that is not infrastructure. There's $100 billion in there for something called the National Science Foundation. And you might say, well, the government can be involved in a little science and research. How bad can that be? Well, in 1972, William Proxmire, who was a conservative Democrat, came out with what was called the Golden Fleece Award. The first one he gave was for a study from the National Science Foundation, $50,000 to study what makes people happy. Fast forward 50, 60 years, we get to the present. The National Science Foundation last year had a $500,000 project to see if you take a selfie of yourself smiling, whether or not that will make you happy if you look at it later in the day. So this is the kind of craziness. Autism. You say, well, I have a child or a granddaughter with autism. Maybe government could study autism. Well, one of the autism grants, which was given ostensibly to study autism, was subcontracted and given to some scientific researcher who wanted to study what Neil Armstrong said when he set foot on the moon. Did he say one small step for man, or did he say one small step for a man? I'm not kidding you. The researchers got $700,000 and they listened to the tape over and over and over again, and they still couldn't decide. $700,000. There's money like this throughout government, but the recent infrastructure bill that you think will be about roads and bridges is adding $100 billion to the National Science Foundation, one of the most wasteful areas of government. I have a simple bill to try to fix it. They won't accept the amendment. I've tried a couple times. My bill says that if you want research money, we should comprise the committee of people you don't know and have never had interactions with. And if you're doing crazy behavioral science, alleged science, like studying whether or not Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine, I think we could poll the audience. But if that's what you're going to study, the people approving your study should not be other people who study animals on cocaine, because they're idiots also, and they're going to approve your project. So what I would do is I would have a committee comprised of people of the big sciences, heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, cancer, things we could probably all agree are major problems. And I would say, should we study the Japanese quail on cocaine or heart disease? I think we might figure things out. I would also put a taxpayer advocate on the committee just to have some dose of common sense. But they won't have any of this. They'll say, you just don't understand, sir. This is science. You just can't understand the science. And they're doing basic research. Well, no, this has been going on since 1970. And they're talking about doubling. It gets $8 billion a year. They're talking about adding another $10 billion to it. This is the kind of insanity we live with. We borrow more than $2 million a minute. In the last 2 years, we borrowed $7 to $8 trillion. It is out of control. And you say, well, aren't there some good things government could do? Well, I'll give you one thing government could do. You know what Andy Beshear could do if he actually cared or wanted to help people in Kentucky? Why don't he let all your family doctors have the vaccine to dispense to their patients? Some people are hesitant to get it for one reason or another, but they've been to a family doctor for 20 years. Who do you think might have the best influence with them? Their family doctor. You can't get the vaccine through your family doctor. The clinic in Bowling Green's been trying to get it for a year. They've written letter after letter to the governor, and they can't get it. It's a clinic of over 100 doctors. I'm guessing they would convince some people that it was in their best interest to take the vaccine, and yet they can't get it. So really, when they say we're going to obey the science, they should tell us what the science is. The thing is, the burden's on the government. If they're going to tell you to sit 6 feet apart, they should show you the science. Well, it turns out MIT looked at the 6-foot rule and apparently probably has no basis in science at all. In fact, it's probably based on your amount of time, how big the exposure is, and, you know, at one point in time when no one was vaccinated, how many people could possibly have it. But there is some science, but none of the things they told you were accurate about the science. On the masks, we could ask the doctor, but I think this is the same rule as it is in Bowling Green. If you go in a room with somebody with COVID, you wear an N95 mask. You don't wear a piece of your cut up undershirt. The cloth masks don't work. When you blow virus-sized particles through a cloth mask, 97% of them go through. The N95 mask works, so we shouldn't lie to people. So Fauci's first lie was masks don't work at all. And that was a lie. He told you that because it's what Plato called a noble lie. He told you masks don't work. Honest and said, you know, we're going to have some limits on the N95 to the public to get them to the hospitals. But then the next lie he told you was that all masks works. Now you see he's got masks peppered everywhere. He's got 3 masks on and he's been vaccinated. So you tell people get vaccinated and still wear a mask. Why? They said, well, you might get a variant or you might spread it to people. I said, show me the evidence. It's the burden of proof of your government to tell you why they're taking your freedoms. They shouldn't just take away your freedom and you got no freedom and you got to prove to us. No, they should have to prove to us the science behind what they're telling us to do. One of the biggest problems we face now, I think, as a country, is there is a mass organized movement to say that we're a terrible country, to say that our origins are horrible, we haven't gotten any better, and that everybody hates everybody because of race. I think nothing could be further than the truth. I'm fine with revisionist history that shows the imperfections of our founding fathers, particularly with regards to race. I think it's been getting better every day. My whole entire lifetime, I think race relations have gotten better every decade. It's not getting worse. It's actually been getting better. There's more intermarriage. There's more integration of churches. There's more voluntary association than there's ever been. I can't remember meeting somebody almost my entire lifetime who's consumed with racial hatred for any reason. And yet we're now told that the whole country's crumbling, and we have to teach about how white people are terrible, how Coca-Cola says you need to bow down and say, I am white and I am sorry. Why are we talking about race in the workplace? We're supposed to not be talking about race. Now everything's about race. I'm white and I'm sorry because I've been too opinionated and too arrogant and too certain of myself. And we don't need math anymore because it's racial. Well, that's the most racist thing I've ever heard. You're implying that people can't do math because of race. That is terrible. But it all gets back to this sort of narrative that it's a bad place. We're not a bad place. I think we're a good people. We're a prosperous people. We're getting better. And I think we have to make sure that we don't let people transform this narrative into that everybody hates everybody, it's a horrible place, and it's getting worse. If we do, bad things will come. The greatness of our country came from the freedom of exchange of intellectual ideas, the freedom of exchange of trade, the division of labor, capitalism. You want to see what happens when you get Bernie-style socialism? Go to Venezuela. They're eating their pets in Venezuela. They have more oil and gas in Venezuela than Saudi Arabia. Socialism doesn't work. But that's where we have this divide in our country. Where are we going? To freedom and capitalism or to socialism and coercion? I think the answer is clear. I think America's a great place, will continue to be. I think it's worth fighting for, and I hope you'll be there with me. Thank you very much.